And first of all, I'm delighted to be here and to talk about finding the mother tree. And I have to say, I mean, you probably already know, but it is one of those rare books that changes the way we look at trees, forests, and at life itself. Suzanne Simard is the world's leading forest ecologist, professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia's Faculty of Forestry. Her book is a moving, deeply personal journey of discovery. The first week of the book's publication, it landed on the Times bestseller list at #4. We've gone back to press. The book is now #7 on the independent bestseller list, where it's been ever since it was published. And the book has just been chosen as one of Amazon's best books of the year, which is great news. Suzanne Simard is a pioneer in the frontier of plant communication and intelligence. She's been compared to Rachel Carson. She's been hailed as a scientist who conveys complex, technical ideas in a way that is dazzling and profound. Her work has influenced filmmakers. James Cameron's The Tree of Souls in Avatar, storytellers, Richard Powers, The Overstory is partially based on her, perhaps mostly based on her. Suzanne's TED Talks have been viewed by more than 10 million people worldwide. In Finding the Mother Tree, Simard brings us into her world, the intimate world of the trees, in which she brilliantly illuminates the fascinating and vital truths that trees are not simply the source of timber or pulp, but are a complicated, interdependent circle of life. That forests are social, cooperative living entities connected through underground networks. Her research has been written about in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, National Geographic, Smithsonian, and in news editorials in CNN, BBC, the Daily Mail, Globe and Mail, the Times, etc. Now, I have to tell you a little bit about how this came to be. When I read the proposal for Finding the Mother Tree, there was something special about it from its first sentences. The voice had feeling and a power and a wisdom that felt deep and profound, and that was immediately apparent to me. Suzanne and I spoke on the phone before the auction, and again, there was a deep connection. While often, when speaking with a writer about a proposal, you might say, why don't you do this or do that? Maybe you should go in this direction. I made it clear to Suzanne from the get-go that I had nothing to add, suggest, question, have clarified. I was just a plain, flat-out admiring reader. There were 12 to 14 other publishers bidding for this book. And even when we stopped bidding, there were many publishers who were set to keep going, intent on it, in fact. And for weeks, months after the auction, agents and foreign publishers who would come into my office, and remember when we had offices, would comment on how they had just seen other American publishers and how these publishers were still, months later, I kid you not, talking about how they had lost this extraordinary book. But more important, how they had marveled at its power and specialness. Suzanne brilliantly proved that there are indeed complex connected networks in the forest that allow trees to feed, care for, protect, inform, nurture, and impart knowledge to other trees, and that also mimic our own neural and social networks. Finding the Mother Tree is the actual scientist telling her story and the story of her discoveries. Simard's scientific work has been called revolutionary and spiritual. And in Finding the Mother Tree, she tells the story of how she came to her ideas and how she proved, against all odds and much derision in the forestry world, that trees do communicate with one another. How they share, she shows us in clear, accessible, but powerful language, how trees perceive one another and transmit information to and from one another, how they share water, carbon, nitrogen through their network, and with the rich often giving to the poor, and with mother trees sending resources to the seedlings around them, helping the young survive, and how the seedlings remember this information, and as they grow, storing the memory in their roots and growth rings. We see that the mother trees absorb animal nutrients, including salmon, bear, and wolf, how they transmit energy and information to their offspring, passing on their lifetime of wisdom to the next generation. But here's the important thing. Finding the Mother Tree is also a deeply personal and affecting story of family, of love, of life and death, of revelation. And Suzanne's story of how she came to her ideas and set about proving them is about as inspiring a journey of discovery as there is, about trusting one's instinct, no matter how extreme or silly something seems, about how true scientific inquiry and inspiration really work on a scientific level, yes, but more profoundly, in a way that is deeply human and full of feeling. So now, the author, guiding spirit, inspirer of this movement and special book that is transforming hearts and minds, please welcome Suzanne Simard.
Oh, thank you, Vicky. Thank you so much. That was lovely. It's really great to meet everybody. Can you hear me? Yes, okay, great. This has been such an incredible journey for me in publishing this book, never mind writing or redoing the research and writing it. And working with Vicky has been such a pleasure. And and her voice in promoting the book, accepting me for what I was, and just saying, just keep doing what you're doing was just incredibly inspiring for me and helped me write this book in a really powerful, personal way. Um, so, I've been doing this research now for basically my entire life. I mean, this is my life's work. Um, I'm a university professor. I teach at all levels, first, second, third, fourth year graduate level courses. I always include this story or this research in my work. I teach mostly a second year forest ecology course where I teach the students these principles in several lectures and take them into the field several times to reinforce what it means. And these students are transformed at the deepest level. So we start out, in the forest, just listening and being with the forest. And a lot of them have never done that before. They've never taken the time from their phones, for their TV or their busy lives, but just to take them in there and be with these old trees and sit silently with them is the beginning of that transformation. And then, by the end of the 5 minutes of sitting in silence, they can hear the birds, they can hear the wind rustling through the trees, they can hear, the squirrels chattering and carrying seeds. They Then I take them back over and over into the forest every week for 4 months and reinforce this with lecture material. And by the end of the course, they're completely transformed and they can't wait to get back out there. And I'm talking about hundreds of students that I teach every year in this way, students from Asia, students from America, students from Europe. It doesn't matter where they're from. They all know this by the end, and they're transformed. And so I do this with my students. I also know that this is taught in all courses, it's taught throughout America and Europe as well. And the reason I know this, just as a little anecdote, I have two daughters who have gone through university. They're 21 and 23 now. And they just say, "Hey, Mom, we just learned about your work in our biology course today, first year biology. Hey, Mom, did you know that, we talked all day and read your paper?" And so these professors who never contact me, they've just incorporated into their materials. And I know this just isn't at UBC. It's also, universities across the United States, universities across Canada, universities in Europe. When I receive my students, in my second year class, or whether I'm teaching third year, fourth year, or in graduate level, and I ask them if they've heard about this work before, and almost everyone puts up their hand. They've heard about it. And so people are teaching it in ad hoc ways, right? The teachers, the professors learn about it, and then they gather their own materials together and they teach it in whatever way they can. Um, in a more formal way, Pearson Textbooks has been publishing in their high school textbooks for over a decade the primary research that was published in Nature. But of course, it's not the whole story. It's just that initial work that grew into a much bigger, fuller story that is now expressed in Finding the Mother Tree. So really, every student, I think, in the world, almost every student is exposed to this in an ad hoc way. you know, whether it's through the TED Talk shown in their classes or through these lectures put together by their professors, you know, or whatever slides they can get. Some of them contact me, but it's being learned. And so it would be really great to include it more formally in the curriculum of, instead of, you know, this sort of ad hoc, who knows what they're it's certainly not the whole story that's being taught. It's just that initial stuff. Um, I have to say, even I just was going to comment too, even in English classes, at upper level English classes, where they're teaching about literature and environmental literature, they're also learning about this work. And I've been invited to give guest lectures. This was before the book was published. And I know the professors were saying, they were saying to me, it would be so great if we could read your material, read your book. So yeah, I think that this knowledge is becoming widespread. It is transforming how people see forests. It's not just in higher level education, it's also you know, in movements across the world, right? I'm getting requests from all over the world to come and join and to help protect forests because it transforms how people see forests. So I think with that, I would just like to hear your thoughts. And Vicky, is there anything else I should cover, do you think?
Well, the one thing, I mean, we weren't planning on having a conversation, but why not? Let's do it for a few minutes. And maybe you want to talk a little bit about, I mean, you grew up, I don't know if everybody knows this, but you grew up in a very sort of serious generational logging family.
Yeah.
So why don't you talk a little bit about how you came to see the forest differently?
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, I mean, I was lucky, I guess. You know, it was just the way it was, is that my family were horse loggers, and they came originally from France and then moved across Canada, you know, living part of for many decades in Quebec and then across to Saskatchewan and landing in British Columbia. And one little story is that the big family, the Simard family, wanted to get out of Saskatchewan because the winters were so harsh, and so they wanted to go to California. And and so they took a train thinking they were going to California, and they went across the country, and then the cattle car doors opened with this big family of 10 kids. Um, and the sun came beaming in, and they thought it's California. And so they jumped out of the cattle car into snow up to their noses. And they weren't in California, they were in the interior rainforests of British Columbia. And they stayed. They didn't try to go to California because it was so beautiful. And they had a homestead, and they started horse logging, and did selective logging. So I remember my grandfather, Grandpa Henry, you know, he would go with, you know, everything he made by hand, his boats, his tools, his PVs, his pike poles, his flumes, water wheels, everything was done by hand, very slow and small. And he would go into the forest each day and map out the one tree that they were going to cut. And sometimes that tree would take a few days to cut down because they were so big. Um, and so this is what I grew up knowing what forestry was this very careful, selective harvesting where the forest just rebounded back. You know, it was, you couldn't tell that anybody had been in there. It was beautiful logging, really. It was craftsman work. And this was handed down through the generations. And so as a girl, you know, growing up in this, of course, that opportunity wasn't even possible for me, because all the women were, you know, in the kitchen raising the kids. But I grew up in the 60s when, you know, things were changing. And so I got to go to university, and they didn't allow girls into forestry school in the 1970s. But when I got there in 1979, they had just opened up the doors. And so I squeaked in with the first set of girls. And I got a job in the forest industry, which was completely different than how I grew up, right? It had gone from these family-owned small we call them jippo operations with a few horses and boats and, you know, and really hard work, to this industrial scale logging, which is clear cutting and planting, and which has really grown today to become this big economic engine that is basically mowing down our forests. And so in British Columbia now, we're at a crisis point. We've only got 3% of our iconic old growth forests left, because they've been clear cut. These forests are absolutely essential to all of us all over the world. I think we all kind of think about these West Coast forests as being intact, but they're not. Um, and the last sticks will be logged. It's all planned out. I was just talking to, I'm going on and on, but I was just talking to the Haida people last night. Haida Gwaii. I don't know if you've heard of the Haida, but the Haida are a First Nation in Canada who are, they're warrior people. They're the ones who built the beautiful totems, the beautiful canoes that we all know about. They had incredible culture built around their family feast systems where, wealth was distributed through generosity and reciprocity. That island is going to be clear cut. It's being clear cut now. To build their last totem, they spent 2 years searching for a monumental cedar to build the totem. It's because they're being clear cut. For what, right? Most of those logs get shipped overseas. They watch the barges leave their island and they never get jobs from this. They don't benefit from it. So there's these movements going on. So this work is, so I'm getting called, not just to Haida Gwaii, but to Fairy Creek, to, the Amazon, to help, right? To help people see the forest as the life support systems that they actually are. And the reason I do this and know this is because of my work and where I came from. I have a different view than most foresters who are out there, working for the man, basically. And we need to transform
Suzanne,
this
let me
thinking.
just ask you one question because it really wasn't until I read this book that I focused on this, and now it's almost painful.
Mhm.
Why don't you, I mean, you've mentioned, clear cutting and old growth. Why don't you mention what each of those forests or the remnants of them? I mean, how should old growth forest be preserved and how should it be cut?
Yeah, so, right now, so our biggest indicators for how the effect of our forest practices are on our global cycles are, climate change and loss of biodiversity. Forestry is a major contributor to both of those things. In fact, deforestation is the main cause of species losses worldwide. And so leaving old growth forest, what we have left is absolutely crucial to keep the balance that we have left and to rejuvenate our species, to rejuvenate our forests so that they can become carbon sinks again. So Canada has shifted in the last 10 years from being a carbon sink, which we need it to be, as we need the Amazon to be, as we need the taiga of Russia to be in order to mitigate climate change. But we've actually shifted them through logging practices and climate change to becoming sources for CO2. This is bad news for all of us. And so we have to, and also there's so much misinformation out there about, well, we'll just plant 1 trillion trees, that'll solve the problem. No, it won't, right? So planting 1 trillion trees is like, um, what is it like? It's like, I don't know what it's like. It's not the solution. So the old growth forests are the sinks, right? They are where the gold lies. And if we replace these with plantations, we lose, about 65% of the forest is immediately emitted to the atmosphere. These seedlings that are going to be planted can't mitigate that. They can't compensate for that. The loss has already happened. Once it's gone, it's gone. And so what's the solution? The solution is to preserve these old growth forests as much as we possibly can. Stop cutting them. Right now, they're all slated to be cut in Canada. They're not stopping. And so we've got to stop this. And then at the same time, we've got to shift our harvesting to second growth forests where we've already compromised these forests, where, yes, there are trees growing back, but let's not lose even more by focusing on old growth forests. And so I think people need to know about this, to know about it so that we can make the right decisions, because right now we're electing governments and not holding their feet to the fire for promises they've broken. And we all depend on this. And I think that my book goes a long ways in helping people understand the seriousness of this problem, and how if we love the forest like the social system that it is, that we love it like our own communities, then we'll start to act properly on forests and forest conservation, to make our politicians, meet their commitments or do better. So it's as critical as reducing fossil fuel consumption. It's the other side of our emissions, right? It contributes a third of our greenhouse gas emissions, logging these old growth forests. Most people don't know this. We also focus on fossil fuels, which we should, but we also need to focus on this other part of the equation. And I think that my book helps people understand that.
Suzanne, you talk about, you know, talk a little bit about what the forests have to teach us and what they've taught you.
Yeah. Well, so, the old thinking, which keeping in mind that, remember I said that forestry was not open to girls until the last few decades. And so all the forest science was through the male eyes. And they really focused on how trees compete with each other. And that this is what structured forest communities, and therefore we need to manage the competition. And so if you look at agriculture practices, forestry practices, all focused around the idea that forests are all about competing. And that comes from Darwinian thinking, right? That was transmitted across to ecology and the application of ecology in forestry and agriculture. And so we've only seen part of the picture. We only understood it as this competitive place, and all of the, the clear cutting, the way we plant trees and grow seedlings, the way we brush out what we call weeds, the way we space forests and turn them into these, uniform plantations, is all based on this idea that competition is the only thing that matters. And then I came along and said, actually, these forests are sophisticated societies, and I did all this research to show that, published it in the best journals. I've published over 200 articles on this in scientific journals. And the uptake has been very, very slow. We're still doing the old ways, right? But I liken it to, my work and other people's work too, that we opened both of our eyes to see the forest, that it's this whole sophisticated way of interacting as a society, not just about competition. And this will transform, if we really embrace this, it would transform how we treat our environment, how we practice forestry, how we practice agriculture. So it's not trivial. It's important. It's a paradigm shift. It's challenges how we've applied Darwinianism. It's transformative, and it needs to happen, right? It's not, and so I feel like my work is a seed, but it needs to be watered and to become a full tree. It needs to get out there so people embrace this and really get behind these changes.
Well, the great news is, and then if there are any questions, I'd love to take some. The great news in terms of, the book, people are, so responding so completely and fully. And, the other thing that's interesting is when you read these reviews, the reviews are not just reviews of a book. They sort of take on this sort of odd reverential tone that I've noticed that I've never seen this before, but it's very distinctive to this book, and I think it's what you provoke in people. But it's interesting because there's a film that's being made, a feature film that's being made. So why don't you talk a little bit about who's in it, or who's making it, who's whatever it, directing it?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Vicky. So Doug Abrams, who is my agent at Idea Architects, said, let's try for a feature film. There's been various documentaries on this work already, and there will be more, but including the people who made Avatar. They're doing another film. Yeah, so we wrote a little treatment and took it to William Morris Entertainment, and William Morris kind of shopped it around to various production companies and actresses, and there was lots of interest. I interviewed Natalie Portman, Kate Blanchett was interested in it, Robert Redford was interested in it, Laura Dern, Rachel McAdam, but we settled on Amy Adams. So Amy Adams got together with, she has a production company called Bond Group, and she got together with another production company called Nine Stories with Jake Gyllenhaal and Reva Marker, and they basically won the competition, I guess you would say. And so they've announced it, and they're in the process right now of finding a screenwriter and a director for the film.
So that's great news. Listen, I'd like to hear, is there anybody who has any questions that you want to ask Suzanne?
I have a question. Ooh, hang on.
Go ahead.
I'm getting
Kimber-
emotional. This is so crazy. Okay. Someone else ask the question and come back to me.
Okay, sure.
I'll ask a question. Tell me a little bit about what it means to have preserve old growth forest. What is an old growth forest? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's important. These are old forests. There actually are definitions for it, and it depends on the forest type. But on the West Coast, the redwoods can live to 1,000 to 2,000 years. Bristlecone pine, 5,000 years. Along the West Coast, the cedars, the ones that are being fought over right now, 1 to 2,000 years old. And they have characteristics. And there are certain species that only live in old growth forests, like suites of species. You've heard of probably the marbled murrelet and spotted owl. That's just the tip of the iceberg of these old growth dependent species. So this is where our biodiversity lies. And they're also huge carbon sinks, right? They store huge amounts of carbon. And they also regulate our water, right? They're the source of clean water. They provide us with clean air. Like they're essential in our big global cycles, right? The carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, to leave these old forests intact. And it's been written about in the United States. We've had some amazing scientists who have written about the need to conserve and protect these old forests to keep the balance of climate. So that because climate is changing so quickly, and the faster we cut down these forests, the worse it's going to get. So yeah, that's old growth forest in a nutshell.
Okay, I'm back and I'm composed. So, what can you share with us in terms of like what can the average citizen do to help when you say like so there's that piece. Secondly, what's happening is I'm remembering this event being a child and my dad was going to have this huge tree torn out of our yard and it was a cottonwood tree, right? So cotton's going everywhere, the roots are coming up and I don't know where it came from, but this happened at 12 years old and I was just like hanging out the window like don't cut down that tree, like I could. It was just like this huge thing and my sweet father relented, and he
Yeah.
did not have the tree cut down.
Oh, isn't
And
that great? What a great story. What a
then
great victory you had.
well, it was a victory, thank you, but it was just kind of like, where did that come from? My parents were not environmentalists, but it was just like
Because
there
you
was
got
something in
something
me.
from that tree. You got some
Yeah.
kind of big nourishment from that tree.
So, yeah.
Kimberly, yeah, thank you for sharing that story. And what you felt was grief, right? And what we're feeling, what the kids are feeling, the kids that are on the lines are putting their bodies on the line, hanging out of trees that police helicopters are plucking them out of those trees and they're hanging on for their dear lives because they're grieving. They're grieving over the loss of our safe environment. They know climate is changing. They learn about it in university and they're putting their lives on the line to save it. And that's what you felt. You felt grief. And this grief is worldwide, right? Once you step out and see the dying forest, you can't help but crumble as a human being because we are all connected to this place. We're all part of this. This is like losing our home, right? So
Yeah.
it's essential we provide support, we provide knowledge and information and wisdom for these kids, the next generations to hang on to so that they know what to fight for. So I appreciate your story. It's a common story. I see people weeping all the time. I drive through my own forest and I am literally like just sick with what's going on. So this is a huge, this is important, right? This is our home. We need to protect our home, and your grief is real and it's widespread.
Thank you.
And you also, though, have to give your father credit because he heard you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah. And I think people want to do the right thing. It's like I bet if you ask anybody, they would say, yes, we need to protect our old growth forests. But somehow it got away on us, right?
They
It was
just
the
don't think about it. They need to know about it to think about it. And it's what I said, once you read this book, you don't look at trees in the same way again. And my house is up in the Catskills. And I published I came up with the idea of doing a history of the Catskills. And in the 19th century, they just cut everything. They just cut everything down there. And I look at those forests, and I look at, I run on a dirt road where it's just trees and nothing else. And I look in those forests and I see trees, but they're all newish trees, even if some of them are very big. And my heart aches for those trees, those huge trees that were just taken down because of the Industrial Revolution to feed this pulse of this country during that century.
Just wanted to, if you don't mind, mention one thing. So my friend is a lifelong farmer who lives upstate, originally from Connecticut. And a couple months ago, he reached out to me and said, "Hey, do you know anything about this book, Finding the Mother Tree?" Because, he's just like, I guess is just very involved in those conversations. And now he's like, "Well, can you let me know, like, whenever she's speaking?" So, like, when I've been, like, putting the, events out every week, I've been, like, texting to be like, "Well, she's going to be doing this on this night." So just letting you know that there are farmers in upstate New York who I guess are going to read the book and do something with it. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's great.
Cool, thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Just a big thank you, both to Vicki and Suzanne. Suzanne, I've read the book. It's
Thank
so
you.
moving. It is so terrific. It will be a huge success, I'm sure, in the college and university markets. And I'm really glad you had a chance to share some of your thoughts and ideas with us this afternoon.
Listen, Keith, one more thing before
Yeah.
you go. Suzanne, do you have any questions that you want to ask anybody?
I'm just listening and learning.
Okay.
So I don't know enough to ask a good question, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, Keith.
Yeah,
I just wanted to say, Suzanne, I hope that by the grace of God, you get to see the ripple effect of what you've done by writing this book. I think that it's going to be a beautiful story that's going to unfold, and hopefully one day you get to see the whole view of it.
I hope so too. I hope we all do. Thank you very much. That's so kind of you.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Right.
Thank you,
Take
everybody.
care.